Greetings, friends. Welcome to day 2 of Watch Week 2023. Our prayer initiative of 168 continuous hours of prayer is going really well. And we're not surprised, are we? God is on the move. Already hearing some incredible testimonies about your time in prayer and how God is moving and moving people that need to hear about the gospel into your lives directly after your prayer. So God is doing wonderful things, and this is what we were talking about in our last devotional yesterday. Was we need to have this expectation about God being on the move. And to do that by not only praying, but also by listening and watching. Watch and pray. The whole concept on which that we built Watch Week, to watch and pray. Normally we don't pair watch with pray, but praying always includes watching. It's a form of meditation, of expectation, in a good sense. So anticipation of what God might be doing and where he might be speaking. So with that being said, I do encourage you, if you haven't seen our last devotion yesterday for day 1, go ahead and do so. It introduces you to Watch Week, as well as opens up this the concept of the devotions that we are now within. So I encourage you to do that. For those of us who are with me here today, because you are vets of our devotion as of yesterday, I want to refer us back to the Nazareth syndrome. That was yesterday's devotion, in which we talked about how that syndrome tends to block the good news from being experienced in our life, because we're just too busy in our own agendas to be on watch for how God is moving. We also talked about how that is done in meditation. When we meditate, it doesn't mean that we're going around with and ah. It's really meeting Christ in the narrative, in the record of history, where when Jesus cooked the boiled fish on the seashore, that we also join him there too. As we are cooking on the stove, we're thinking about how Jesus experienced that cooking time, and how when we come and we eat, that we eat slowly, because we are reminded of how God provides our daily bread. And all the mess, all the agendas that we have, it's going to be there. God's going to provide for us. We don't need to hasten the day. And that's why we eat slowly, and we think about God's provision and peace, not in anxiety, in which we eat so much food within. We scarf down food. So we talked about some examples of how our daily activities can bridge the gap between prayer and watching, or prayer and meditation, and vice versa. Here this morning, join me in the book of 1 Kings chapter 18 and 19. Yesterday we did talk about how God's voice is everywhere for those who watch, but it is an important thing to discuss the 1 Kings passage, because it tells us that although there's a lot going on around us, and sometimes it looks miraculous, that sometimes that God's voice is really in the things that might not be so clear. Prophet Elijah is best known for his representative work for God on Mount Carmel. If you remember the narrative there in 1 Kings, he had defeated the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Now, Elijah was the one who challenged the godless people to a barbecue cook-off, in the sense that a cow would be seared. The challenge for each group was to call on the name of their God, asking for fire to come down and consume their cow, consume the offering. Now, it seems kind of odd until you realize that meat sacrifice or cow sacrifice is a normal occurrence in the worship of these two people. They believed that it would please their deity. And when we read 1 Kings 18 and 19, we see that it's the godless prophets that did just about anything and everything to gain the attention and appeasement of their deity, short of killing themselves, literally. They went around screaming, yelling, dancing. They even cut themselves with swords until they were standing in their own blood. It was full of anxiety for the godless prophets. And what I love about Prophet Elijah is that he began to taunt these already anxious, godless folk. And he more or less says, shout louder. Surely he cannot hear you. Perhaps he's deep in thought, or he's relieving himself. Maybe he's busy, or he's on a journey. Maybe he's sleeping. He might need to be awakened. Now, Elijah is giving these godless prophets a bit of smack talk, because Elijah knows what's going on. And Elijah is revealing their state of mind in all seriousness. The state of mind being this: our God is far away, and we need to find him. We need to do something dramatic and loud, or else he won't pay attention to us. He won't find us. Now, their high-stake challenge for their false god's ability ended in raw meat. Nothing was consumed that day. Now, like every good Bible college student knows, God always offers an alternative to religion of the false kind. And Elijah offers an alternative in this situation. At the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah steps forward and he prays two simple sentences. Two. It's not complicated, very simple. There's no yelling, dancing, none of that kerfuffle. In verses 36 and 37, we find those two simple sentences. Make sure to highlight those two verses. In the Hebrew, since I'm a Hebrew and Greek nerd, if you look at it, the text expresses something very profound. And it's this idea of Elijah drawing near to God and then pleading to God in a very personal, intimate, in a direct way. And it more or less says, reveal yourself so that they might be acquainted with you, Lord, and know that I did this because of my relationship with you. For the false prophets, this is a very different approach to God. It's relational. It's direct. In fact, it shows that God already has his attention on us. It's relational. It's not based on performance or radical commitment to impress. It's not an event occurring out of our need for something to be done in order to have a relationship with God. But it's this display that Elijah is showing us that something is already done. that has already established the relationship. And God delivered a roaring cookout that day. We're told that the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offerings, the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw this, they fell on their faces, which was a great response. And they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." It's as though Elijah is a son who brings his father in to the classroom on Parents' Day to reveal what his father is able to do. It's like a second grader boy bringing his firefighter dad into the classroom, starting a fire so that dad has to put it out. It's kind of like that. It's showing or demonstrating what God is all about, his ability as a great, powerful God. But now here comes something more personal for you and I in regards to Elijah. Elijah is God's representative. He represents someone who has a relationship with God, who knows what kinds of things are really occurring in the spiritual realm, and he knows how to pray. He just gave us a great prayer, and something goes unchanged in Elijah, and that's where things get kind of personal, because we find ourselves in a very similar situation with Elijah. In this spectacular event of God revealing himself to this passive audience of humanity, something does go unchanged in Elijah's heart. After Elijah's most significant day, probably in his ministry ever as a prophet, he becomes endangered. His life is endangered, it's threatened, and he more or less escapes the day as a team of assassins are running after him for a full day. A bounty has marked his head. And then he finds himself resting underneath a shade of a tree, and he actually prays. And this time it's not a great prayer, it's a lousy, cowardly prayer. And that is, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Elijah is being a very immature person at this point. He's had enough. He's depressed. He's frustrated. He's anxious. He's tired of running. He just wants God to go ahead and take him out. He doesn't want to go through another day. He's being a coward here, but it shows how weak we still can be, regardless of whether or not we're mature. We all have weak moments in ministry. And God sends an angel and feeds Elijah some hot bread in a jar of water. I love that picture. Waking up and finding warm bread that's really been toasted, roasted, baked with nice crisp, hard crust, breaking it in, see the steam coming up, just to smell that, it's really, wow, this is life, it's substance, provision, right? It's going to sustain you. And then we have a jar of water. I'm a potter, so I know whenever you put water into a jug of water, especially like earthenware, it actually starts to sweat. And as it sweats, it evaporates off of the jug and actually cools the water inside the jug. So I can see Elijah eating this beautiful, fluffy and crusty loaf of bread with this really nice, cold, refreshing jar of water. And just to think about the humanness he must have felt in that moment of being rejuvenated, thinking, wow, I'm more than just someone on the run. I'm being provided for. God cares for me. He cares of my humanity. I'm going to be all right. But that night, he hides in a cave. And afterwards, God more or less says, Elijah, what on my green earth are you doing here? And Elijah's response was one of self-pity. It was more or less a recital of how much he did for God. But unexpectedly, God doesn't address him on these, pitiful, self-pitying recital words. God doesn't address that whatsoever. He cuts to the chase and he says, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Now, what happens next in the narrative is quite confusing. It tells us, and behold, the Lord passed in a great strong wind toward the mountains and broke pieces of the rock before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. To which we say, okay, pause. What do you mean? God caused the rocks to break in pieces, but yet God was not in the rocks? Not in the wind? I don't understand that. Well, let's continue. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. So you get these stacks here of things that have happened miraculously, but yet, although God has done those things, has caused those things, he's not in them. It kind of harkens back to what we just read in chapter 18, where God actually is the cause of fire. The fire itself wasn't what connected Elijah and God together, but it was the prayer, the already established relationship, the prayer that Elijah had with God. The fire was an aftermath of that. So far we're going down the list, and God is everywhere, but yet he's not speaking in them, it would seem, because although God is causing these things in a miraculous way, he's not in them. He's not speaking through them. So the very last thing on the list is fire, and we know last time fire arrived, God was all in that. So what's going on now? But last on our list, truly the last one, is the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a cloak, and he went out and he stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, Elijah, what are you doing here? He said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I am even the only one left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said to him, go and return your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall appoint Hazael to be king over Assyria. And yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. So here we have the events leading up to God saying, what on my green earth, Elijah, are you doing here? And then the prophet's self-pitying recital of a resume and a short little self-pity recital of events as well. And God commands Elijah to get back on program. As program manager here at Mercy Partners, I have to do that a lot to remind us to get back on program. I get off program probably more than anyone. And I hear these words from God often. Go ahead, return back on your way. Things are not done yet. The whole idea here is God was speaking through things that Elijah wasn't expecting. It's obvious now that God didn't send the angel to Elijah to make him feel better about himself, but to keep him alive until Elijah was ready in his spirit to hear the voice of God in a way that Elijah wasn't expecting. God came to Elijah in a very loving way. His method of speaking was most unusual, and in a way it was least expected. But his voice was in a low whisper. It was hardly audible. His voice spoke tenderly to the broken-hearted, defeated feeling prophet. God is making a point, not only to Elijah, but to us. He's making the point, I speak differently than the world. Guess what? God does not advertise. He does not make marketable. He does not blast attention-seeking sound bites. Neither does his voice create tons of demands like the ones that always grab for our attention in the world. Instead, it speaks to us in a tender way. It speaks to those who truly listen. And God is also telling us through Elijah's experience that to be with me, you have to be different. If you and I are going to connect with God through prayer, we need to come to him in a different way. To be with him, we must be different. I like what Henry Nouwen, what he realized about God's approach to being with us. And he revealed his thoughts in a profound truth. He writes this: "Now I wonder whether I have sufficiently realized that God has been trying to find me, know me, and love me during all this time. The question is not how am I to find God, but how am I to let myself be found by him. The question is not how am I to know God, but how am I to let myself be known to God. And finally, the question is not how am I to love God, but how am I going to let myself be loved by God." Maybe all this time we have been wrong about prayer, about where the voice of God is. A lot of times we are constantly instructing God of our feelings without sitting in our feelings. It's okay to be disappointed. A lot of times we don't have love for ourselves, and we have a hard time being with God in such a way that we find that we can have this appearance of being acceptable towards him. But what these two scriptures tell us in 1 Kings 18 through 19 is this idea that we pray because of a relationship that has already been established. We don't go around banging on drums and yelling chants because God is already drawn near to us. We don't need to find him. In that sense, the saint does not need to find God because he is near. In fact, we are temples of his Holy Spirit. What we need to realize is that we need to slow down, we need to watch and pray, and realize that in order to be with God, we just need to be different. It means that in all of our relationships with the world that is predicated on finding approval, making ourselves acceptable in order to be in someone's presence, that something needs to change. That's what happens out in the world, but we're talking about our spiritual relationship with God. It's completely different economy of relationship. There's a different type of connection in which we go, we are found by God. Elijah shows this. He exemplifies this by listening to the whisper. A lot of stuff is going on, but he doesn't go out and seek God. The voice of God comes to him. Now, to be fair, he did get out of the cave, and a lot of times we had to get out of the cave of our own minds in order to be out in what God is doing. But a lot of times we're passive. And we're not passive in the sense of letting everything in thought drift by, but this spiritual sense of being open to what does God want to say to me now, and not have any expectations about what type of reaction or what type of emotion we need to bring to God in prayer. Just say, God, find me. And some people have a hard time with that because it's like, I don't think that's prayer. I would beg to differ. You look at 1 Kings 18 and 19, and it's pretty incredible. And then you think about the 100 sheep. One leaves, and he leaves the 99 for the one. He goes out and he seeks the sinner. So if he seeks the sinner, surely God comes and finds us, especially when we are the temple of his presence. He's going to find us. A lot of times we just need to sit tight and realize that there's already a relationship that connects us to him, and we just need to slow down and be found by God, because he wants to speak to you, but in a different way than the world's speaking. The clamor of life is not God's nature. Neither is his truths found in excessive mass, intensity, density, energy. No, it's more usual for the voice of God to be invisible, quiet, soft, and direct. And we can only hear God's voice when we follow him into what pleases him the most in a contemplative life. While busyness and inattentiveness distracts us from God's presence and where he's speaking in the slow ways of life, when we slow down, when we don't rely on our good works alone to drive our faith, our energy. It's just like Elijah, he was being about God's business, but then came a time for him to slow down, to be found by God, listen, and then get back to work.